Big Reginald here. I've been doing my best to study Oberyn for the last little while. I think I know what to do with a lot of his weapons, but I am not yet confident I can recommend anything good for a talent rework with my level of familiarity with the class. So for now, I'm going to just focus on weapons. Today we're going to buff the Cleavers. All my weapon buffs are predicated on my previous suggested enhancements for Oberyn in this video, most especially giving his dodges linger time. Now, back before patch 14, the Oberyn Cleavers were actually the meta choice for melee on Oberyn, specifically the Bull Butcher Mark III Cleaver. Nowadays, it is widely accepted that the Krork Mark IV is the better Cleaver, but all of them are considered C tier. There's a lot of reasons for this, but the most important one is simply that their damage just didn't keep up with the increased health pools enemies received across the board in patch 14. I mean, this weapon has a decent blessing pool between Savage Sweep, Slaughterer, and Thrust being on the table, along with some other options that are frankly perfectly decent. So in this case, I'm going to just leave them alone, though I wouldn't mind swapping Unstoppable Force for Deathblow and Devastating Strike for Wrath, or something like that, considering Oberyn's terrible crit rate. Let's talk shop, and I'll keep this very simple. The Oberyn Cleavers should basically just become the same as the Heavy Swords. I do have some tweaks I want to do from there, but if you want the short version of my idea, that's kinda it. I'm going to turn the Cleavers into the Heavy Swords, and then modify them so they're still unique. First up, the shared stats. Starting with mobility. We're going to ditch the mobility stat as a possible dump stat and swap it for defense. This means we can expect the Cleavers to have stable mobility that we can now set intentionally. The top of the sprint speed for Oberyn's Cleaver Sprint template is 1, which should put us at faster than most other characters who aren't using faster weapons on their own. Though, we may want to look at increasing that just a little bit to make sure that they feel like they're faster weapons than the typical, so we might want to even increase it. Second, we're going to drop the sprint cost by 0.15, so it's a bit more sprinty. This would be going from 1 per second to 0.85 per second. A bit better than the Heavy Sword, actually. We won't be doing any knife speed runs like this, but it's going to feel a lot more mobile and facilitate aggressive play, which is kind of the idea. Next, we will talk dodges. We set knife dodges to 5, as is appropriate. Second, we get rid of this insane -7 to -9% dodge distance debuff on the weapon class. It's literally worse than my pickaxe right now. This should be Oberyn's most defensively safe and mobile weapon. I don't know what number to set here, so let's just go with make it good. That should be perfect for aggressive melee Ogryns looking to dive hard, or for defensively oriented gunluggers looking for a safety stick with good action economy. Now I want to talk about cleaver behavior. The Cleavers should cleave. It's in the name. Okay, so I went poking around the data and I could not find the cleave values for the Cleavers, and the Heavy Sword was set at just Big Cleave. And I don't know what that means, so let's just keep it simple. Whatever it is on the Heavy Sword, it should be the same on the Cleavers. I know from simple range tests that cleave values on the Heavy Sword are better than Cleavers, so it's an easy fix. Copy paste. Finally, the Special Punch. Now I got this from one of my comments, actually a couple, so thank you to you for those good ideas. This is going to be for all the Cleavers, so I'm going to say this here and not repeat myself on each individual mark. Against unarmored, infested, and maniac enemies, I would like to give the Special Punch 300 body and 350 weak spot damage. Against flak enemies, give it 200 and 250. What I want here is to punch heads off. It's a single target attack in a horde shooter, and I'm an Oberyn. I don't swing that fast. This will not break the game. It won't even be better than my light attacks most of the time, but it will be downright hysterical, and that's all the justification it needs, though it'd also be lore accurate too, so it's a win-win. Now let's talk about each pattern individually. I will be assuming no changes to the Oberyn tree for these buffs. Bully Butcher Mark III Cleaver. This is the OG, and we'll need to fix it. The 3 lights actually have the same damage profile. The main issue I see here is the damage itself. Sure, on paper is better than the Heavy Sword, but the Heavy Sword is way faster. It has Head Taker instead of Slaughter and can build stacks without kills, and is on Vet, Psyker, and Zealot, who all have plenty of damage pumps in their trees to hit nice little breakpoints with ease. Meanwhile, the Cleaver, despite being the size of an entire human torso and being swung by a 900-pound gorilla man who can tear a human apart with his bare hands, is stuck at best using merely Slaughterer stacks. Soften them up and assign their 5% damage node until he starts throwing heavies. This is why his lights feel so bad until his stacks and keystones get going. My gut says the weak spot damage should clear 300 on infested and unarmored and probably hit 200 into flak and maniac, while body shots should maybe get a 10 to 15% buff. This is basically quality of life tier damage buffs that will make light attacks good and relevant and feel good. I'd have to test this to know whether or not it's too much, but I'd like to at least try. My kind of thinking here is that I'd like to see weapons that are one-handed on Ogryn do as much damage base as weapons that are two-handed on human characters, but I'm just kind of guesstimating how to land that properly without being unbalanced. The real meat and potatoes that will bring this weapon back to life is the heavy attacks. First, the strike down. The sore thumb on this is not the body shot damage, which is, I guess, close enough compared to a heavy sword. We can just bring that in line. The problem when we compare this to the Mark 9 heavy sword strike down of the same type is the weak spot damage. This is just insanely worse. So let's just crank those numbers directly in line, but for one thing. I want to see the carapace be even higher. Let's aim at 300 or 350. It'll need testing, but I doubt it's going to be a big deal from a balance perspective, and I think it'll feel a lot better. Next, the Vanguard Sweep. Once again, the weak spot damage is unhinged. Besides carapace, let's just match up these numbers roughly with the heavy sword and call it a day again. The exception here is carapace. I think we should look at the sweep and give it roughly the heavy sword special attacks carapace damage, which is about 150 on body and 200 on headshot, and I think that would be totally acceptable and it would not be OP. It's also critical for our next weapon, which would be the Krork Mark 6 Cleaver. This Cleaver is honestly in such a weird spot. It has a heftier blade visually than the Mark IV, but a point like the Mark III, so it seems like it's meant to bridge the gap between the two styles. It has kinda crosswise light attacks that are marketed as strike downs, but without really behaving like them. Except the third light, which is actually a stab and has the same profile as the Mark IV stab. Since it's the same profile, I'll address it in the Mark IV section. Then the heavy attacks are also just these two crossing attacks that have inferior performance into armor and offer nothing that either the Mark III or Mark IV do. I'm going to propose we largely take the same approach here and just try to line up the numbers with the heavy swords, but I think this weapon is going to need an extra animation. I propose that we add a heavy 3 into the chain that is an overhead heavy 1 from the Mark IV and Mark III. We polish that up by looping special into heavy 3, which connects to light 3 and lets you access a solid elite busting heavy light chain. Okay, let's talk the Mark IV Cleaver. In case you weren't aware, this Cleaver is basically the same as the Mark III, but it has 2 stabs at the start. Otherwise, its heavy and light attacks share profiles with the Mark III, so all the changes above apply here too. Those 2 stabs, though, need to be looked at. The stabs. We need to bump the weak spot damage and base damage for these stabs, and the one on the Mark VI as well. About 10% more body shot damage seems right offhand, and I think we need to push the unarmored and infested damage into the 300 range base, maybe 350. The carapace should also get a slight bump, up to around 200 to 250. In my view, this will make the stabs feel really impactful on Ogryn, but not feel overpowered, because they won't have a lot of cleave in our single target or 1 or 2 target attacks. I still expect they'll feel a bit anemic in high havoc, but we're not balancing for that, so we'll just have to see how it plays out. With Ogryn's various rending and damage buffs on the table, he should be able to pump out some pretty impressive numbers here, but will likely overkill into unarmored and infested as those buffs become live, so it won't matter there, but it'll make the weapon feel right on initial hit into trash mobs. Why my enormous torso-sized stabber doesn't destroy a Poxwalker skull on contact is currently quite baffling. Alright, I think that's all the changes I have had in mind. I have tried to be thorough but brief. I will say that I'm not absolutely certain about these numbers. It's not like I sat around breakpoint calculating for hours, but intuitively and based on some of my study, I think this seems reasonable and shouldn't throw anything too out of whack. Obviously, testing is important, so we would want to confirm my assumptions here, but at least we're getting started. I'll continue to poke at the Ogryn problem, but I want to address the batter problem real quick. Ogryn crutches on bleed stacks pretty hard, but I do have a hypothesis on this point. I suspect that as we buff his weapon damage, we are actually not going to see his damage scale that much, and the reason I think that is because the more direct damage he does, the less bleed ticks it will take to kill an enemy, and thus the fewer bleed stacks applied by multiple hits will be necessary or useful for that matter. Essentially, I think we're going to see something like Overbleed eat up most of the value of this node into a lot of targets, while not really harming the balance of Ogryn too much. Maybe I'll end up being wrong on that, but I think we'll have to test it before I can say for sure. I probably need to put a little disclaimer here that just because I am a playtester doesn't mean any of these ideas have been implemented at all. This is just my YouTube thoughts, just as before, back when I was doing the chain weapons way back when. These are the ideas I have, and I would be really open to suggestions from players who are more familiar with Ogryn or have other balanced ideas that they think would be better. This is just my pass at it, so I'd like to get a conversation started in the comments below, as I do read those and try to respond to most of them. I think it's important for me to get feedback from other people as we try to balance Ogryn to be good, but I'd like to start with the Cleavers because I think they're cool weapons and are underused right now. I would like to provide a special thank you to members Tosh, Miles Williams Lewis, and Bonehead. Your atypical support really means a lot to me, and I appreciate it. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the rest of my members, and support helps the channel a lot. If you would like to become a member of this channel, there is a link in the description below and a join button next to the subscribe button. Thank you all so much for visiting. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.